screen. Can you guys see the screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Thanks for it. I'm just still waiting for it to go live, and then I'll start. Yes, so it's live. Let me start this. And according to my clock, you're right, and we have people coming in. That's good. Let's give folks a minute, and then I'll start. So it's 1 minute past. So let me start. Hi everyone. Today is our second day of our main event. It is all about IPv6 and IPv6 extension headers. So hope you guys enjoy the discussion today. Welcome. So this is the agenda for today. We have Nalini kicking off by giving an introduction and setting the scene to all IPv6, all things related to IPv6 extension header. We have a talk on fragmentation, IPv6 fragmentation by Geoff, and then a very interesting panel discussion where we have luminaries from industry, from all walks of life. We have Eric Vyncke, who will be moderating the session, and then Ron Bonica, Darren Dukes, Mike Ackermann, Justin Lerman, and Fernando Gont on the panel. So really looking forward to the panel discussion today. So that's for our agenda. Let's kick it off. And like usual, the first thing that we need to do is thank our sponsors, because without their generous help, we won't be able to do these activities for you. So this iteration of connections have been sponsored by Cisco, APNIC Foundation, Internet Society, and Juniper. They have provided support for us in the past as well. So we are really grateful for their continued support in our mission from both IISOC and INTC. We really thank them for their contribution. So before we kick off, we have a very special video message from Lars Eggert, who is the ITF chair. And let me enable the sound and optimize for video. And let's listen in from Lars.
Hi, my name is Lars Eggert, and I chair the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Connections 2022. I think this is the 5th event in the series, and I'm happy to see that Connections seems to have become a fixture for the Indian internet community. Over the next few days, you'll see a number of fascinating talks by experts in the field. They touch on all kinds of topics that are of active interest to the IETF, may become so in the near future, or are otherwise of interest to the internet. We just wrapped up IETF 113, which was our first hybrid IETF meeting. By hybrid, we mean an IETF meeting where a large number of people met in person in Vienna, but an even larger number of people were online all around the world. Because travel will still be difficult for the foreseeable future due to COVID, we expect that all IETF meetings going forward will be hybrid, i.e. they'll have a large number of participants online, much larger than before COVID. It's free to attend the IETF remotely, and it will remain free in the future. I hope that many of you took opportunity to join IETF 113 remotely and will consider participating in future IETF meetings, either remotely or in person. Speaking of in person, the IETF is actively trying to hold an in-person meeting in India. I've been to India many times for work, and I believe it would be an excellent place for the IETF to start meeting in. We've done an initial consultation with the IETF community and have identified a number of cities with suitable facilities. This is unfortunately a slow process. We plan IETF meetings far in advance, and because we had to rebook some hotels due to COVID, that timeline has been pushed out even more. But the process is underway, and I hope we can make it happen. So with that, it's my pleasure again to welcome you to Connections 2022. Enjoy the talks. Bye.
Thank you, Lars. And in fact, it was amazing to hear from Lars that he thinks that, there was, when we started IISOC, this was one of our vision that in a couple of years, what if we can have enough community in India that we actually have an IETF meeting. Now things have pushed down a little bit, but it's good to hear from Lars directly that the dream is not dead, it's still there, and hopefully we will have an IETF meeting in India someday.
Hi,
So let's kick off our main session. Just some housekeeping. We will be using Zoom Q&A. Please type in your question. You can type in the question while the presentations are going. Please don't wait for the end moment. So that's always good. And if you would like to speak, please let us know. Send a message on chat and I can unmute you and we can let you talk as well. But our preferred mode is the Q&A. Feel free to use the chat to ask questions, give information, discuss with other participants. But when you have questions for the speakers or panelists, that goes in Q&A. We have also been trying a way to give you more incentives to ask questions, and the best question of the day, we will decide that at the end of the session. And we will also try discuss with you and find a good charity and cause that you believe in, and IISOC and INTC will try and make a donation to that cause on your behalf. So use this opportunity and ask the best question today. We have, in fact, a whole hour of panel discussion, and we really are looking forward to more active engagement from the community in today's session. So the first session is Introduction to IPv6 extension header. This will be given by our own Nalini, who is the president and founder of INTC. She also is the founder and CEO of Insight Products, which does a lot of cutting edge work in network management and diagnostic. And it's my pleasure to have known Nalini for a long time. She was the founding advisory member for setting IISOC. I was a part of INTC establishment as well. So it's been really great working with Nalini. All this while, we have different personality. We look at things in different ways, but it's always good to work with someone who challenges you and makes you look at things in different way. And I hope Nalini sees the same role from me. And we have a good long relationship in building this community and working together. So let's move on to the technical work. We are here to set the scene with IPv6 extension headers, and nobody can do a better job than Nalini. So off to you, Nalini. Go and share your screen.
Okay, thanks so much, Dhruv. It's been a pleasure working with you all these years, and I hope to do so for many more. Everybody can see my screen now?
Yes, Nalini.
Okay, great. All right. So guys, this whole day is going to be about IPv6 extension headers. And so what I want to do is let's make sure everybody's on the same page, as to what they are. And so then we can consume everything else and the discussions better. So what I'm going to tell you about is, why do we have extension headers and what do they do and what some of the controversies around them. And so then you'll be in a much better place to have your own opinions about everything else that goes on. And please go ahead and ask questions whenever you want. So let's back up a little bit, okay? So here's I've put up the IPv4 main header and the IPv6 main header, not the extension headers or not the IPv4 options, but the main headers themselves. So what's the first problem that we see? Or not the problem, I mean, what's the biggest difference? Well, look to me like that old IPv6 main header is twice the size of the IPv4 main header. And what's the big difference? Well, it's the address size. And so what happened is, because that address is so big, other things had to be taken out. So take a look at that v4 header. You can see that in some ways it looks a lot more complicated than the v6 main header. V6 main header is actually pretty simple, What we've got in there, fixed 40 bytes, has to go out with every single packet. And that's the thing. If we're going out with every single packet, you want to be pretty darn careful about what you put in there. And you might still get some controversy about, like, do we actually need traffic class and flow label? What's flow label used for, et cetera, et cetera. But let's leave all that. I mean, because it's a little bit late to change that part. But anyway, so you'll see that the biggest thing are these very large fields for source address and destination address. There are a few other things, basically having to do with class of service kind of stuff. And I'm not going to talk about that very much in this presentation because we want to talk about extension headers. At some point, we would like to talk about some of that stuff, but we won't. But one of the things that you see in here is payload length. So, you know, anytime you see a length, then you know it can be variable. So what's one thing you don't see? You do not see header length. Well, you don't see header length because you don't need it. It's fixed. So as I said, if we had taken all the stuff that used to be in the V4 header and also added that to the V6 headers, instead of being 40 bytes, there'd be 4 other bytes in there. And so let's go back. What 4 bytes were left out of this? Well, okay, so we took out the identification and fragment offset, and looks like the flags a bit too. So we've taken out those. Well, were they important? Where'd they go? So what has happened is there's a whole new concept called IPv6 extension headers. And you know, some people think we should not have these. Routers drop them. I'll tell you about a lot of these controversies. So now, and I'm going to be very clear, I'm a huge proponent of IPv6 extension headers, and I'll tell you why, you know, later. But that's my point of view. So I want to be very transparent about that. I very much support this whole concept. So how is it working? So in the main header, what it says in here, it says the next header we're going to get is called 5, header 5. We don't know what header 5 is yet, but that's header, but it'll be the next one. And in header 5, it says, you know, the next one is going to be 8. And then when you get to 8, he says, well, the next one is the data, is the payload itself. When you get to the payload, then that's it. And of course, you don't have to have any extension headers. Right in the main header itself, you could just say, well, the next header is data. See, look right here. You see that next header field? You could just say right in there, the next header you see is going to be the data field. So there's a couple of rules around this whole extension header business. One, they can only appear once, except for the destination options header. That's a special header, and that can appear multiple times. But other than that, it can only appear once. Like, for example, you can't have like 12 routing headers or 12 fragment headers. No. You can only have them once. And this last one is the protocol field, like what the data actually is. You may remember that from IPv4 as being the protocol field. And now, of course, this is going to get super crazy if we start doing things like for example, a 41, if we have IPv6 and IPv6 and start chaining that. Okay, my head hurts. So generally, you have things like the next header, the data payload is actually TCP, UDP, ICMPv6, you know, something like that. So let's take a look at a real a next header example of chaining. So what you might have in the main header, you say the next header is header 0. Now that happens to be the hop by hop header. And then in the hop by hop header, you say the next header is 44, which is the fragment header. And then he says next one is TCP payload. And so you just follow the header chaining across. Well, so what are all my options here? What can I have? Well, these are the common ones that you can have as extension headers. And there's there's some controversy around some of them, and I'll tell you kind of what the story is. So you'll see hop by hop, routing, fragment header, ESP and AH. You may know those from IPsec, of course, because EH and AH and ESP were backported to IPv4, and then we have destination options. And I'll go through and give you examples of each. So, for example, let's take a look at the next header 0. See, take a look here. This is our IP main header. And so what do we have in here? First thing, we have version 6. We have not set traffic class or flow label. Okay, interesting. And then we say the payload length is 32. Well, that's a little bitty payload. Wonder, well, you know what? That's because why? Because we're doing neighbor discovery. Well, so it's an ICMP payload. But you see here, the next header is the hop by hop options header. And you know, that is a very, very useful header. And we'll talk about that a bit. But you can see here the chaining in the hop by hop option header. And here he comes. He says the next header I have in here is ICMP v6. That's our data payload. And here that comes. And of course, because this is a neighbor discovery, we kind of figured we were going to have ICMP in there anyway. But here we are, proof that we do have ICMP in there. And you can see here, what are they using this hop by hop header for? Well, it looks like it's an MLD having to do with, it sounds like multicast listener discovery, and it's a router alert. So now you see why this hop by hop options header is being used. What the idea is hop by hop has to be opened by everybody along the path. That means every router. And so then you can set something like a router alert in that. Now, of course, you can quickly see where this might go all wrong. It's like, I know how I can DDoS or DOS your system. I'm going to send me out a ton of hop by hop options headers and make your routers do a whole bunch of work. Well, not just routers, anybody along the path do a bunch of work. And so people are understandably a bit leery about sending out this very useful function. But you can see here it is indeed used. So let's take a look at this hop by hop header. And so the first thing in there is what's the next header, and then the length of this header in bytes. Now, here's something else. Now, what did I say about if you see a length field? Anytime you see a length field, what do you know? Oh, you know it's not fixed length, that is, right? You know it's variable length. And so here's where we get into another little controversy. Is, okay, say you're having to parse things. I don't care if it's in a program. Well, it's got to be it's got to be code of some type. I mean, whether it's actually in software or in hardware. So let me ask you, if you have to parse something which has variable headers or something which has fixed length headers, what's easier to do? I mean, I'm not saying variable length headers in a routine is that hard to do, but certainly fixed headers is certainly slightly easier. So here comes another little controversy around extension headers. They call it, it's like they call the beginning of it, the TLV. You may hear that term thrown around, TLV, type length value. So what it's basically saying is anytime you've got to parse things that are TLV, you've got to first figure out what's the type of the header, how much is it, and then what the value is. And so again, people are concerned about the amount of time that all takes. And again, okay, so being completely transparent, I am a extension header bigot. You know, no function is free. If you want something, there's a little bit of a cost for it. So if it's a worthwhile function, maybe it's worth paying that. Of course, that's the controversy. Worthwhile to whom exactly, right? So let's keep moving here. Let's go along to something which is, let me say, interesting. It's the fragment header. Now, see, in IPv4, what used to happen with fragmentation? In IPv4, fragmentation was done in the main header itself. And a lot of people felt at the IETF that fragmentation doesn't happen that often, and it's a pain in the neck for routers to do. So in IPv6, you can only have what's called source fragmentation. That means that you have to do path MTU discovery, which is another whole thing that I won't get into. You have to figure out what the MTU of the path is, and then do fragmentation at the source, meaning at whoever is sending it to start with. You can't be doing fragmentation, by some router. Remember, that happens in IPv6. But so people moved because, as I said, I mean that IPv6 header was getting pretty big to start with. So it's like, all right, well, let's move this out. But what happened then, and this is actually when Mike and I got involved in the IETF, there's a field in there called IPID. And it used to be for matching up fragments in IPv4, but it turned out it was a de facto sequence number. And in doing diagnostics, we at enterprises and people diagnosing large, complicated networks, we used to use that as a sequence number. And then, as I said, that was the thing that got Michael and I, because we were just like, oh my God, where is it? It's missing. It's gone. How are we going to do diagnostics? Oh my God. And that was approximately our conversation. And so that's when we brought PDM and all that kind of stuff in. So here it is. Here's the fragment header. So first you got the next header. It's pointing to what's going to be changed to, or the payload itself. Then fragment offset. And then at the very last, there's that 32-bit IPID that we used to use to such great effect. So, then let's talk about a new one. This is an interesting option. And I'll tell you, this is the kind of thing that makes me really love extension headers. And the reason for that is that if you really want the protocol to be long-lived, you need to make it extensible. And what I mean by extensible, meaning that, no matter how smart you are and how many people you have on your team, you're not going to be able to know all the possible wonderful things people might be able to do in the future. And so if you provide a way that people can add new things relatively easy to your protocol, that's going to make life and your protocol last a lot longer. It's like providing a way for a constitution to have amendments, for example. If you can amend the Constitution and make it live, well, then that helps. And so this is one such example. And so what is this whole thing with destination options? Destination options is really something that the source and host can communicate all the way to the destination host. It can put something in, and then the routers, I mean, the people along the middle are really, now this is again a little bit of a controversy. They're not really supposed to look at it. I suppose they could, I mean, and who's going to know if they do? But it's not intended. It's not intended for the middle boxes. And heaven forbid, the middle boxes are totally not supposed to be adding something to that or adding a destination option or changing it. And when I say communicating, you might think, oh my goodness, well, that's certainly interesting. Well, what kind of things might I want to communicate? Well, so for example, I'll bring up the example of our little PDM, our performance and diagnostic metrics. What we're communicating is things like the sequence number and response time information back and forth. That's quite useful to the source and destination. And here's one where it's being used in mobile IPv6. You can go up to the IANA website and take a look at destination options, actually all the IPv6 extension headers, and see who is using them for what. There's a lot of very, very interesting uses for destination options. So let's move on to a new one. And here is the IPv6 routing header. Now, okay, so the routing header has become somewhat controversial, and in particular, routing header 0. That's what it's called. And here's a source routing header 0, and essentially you can see here that it's saying that it's got 3 addresses left. So let's do a little bit of what is source routing, what's kind of the whole deal with source routing. Essentially what you're telling it is like, I want you to go to, I'm telling you, like, don't be doing no dynamic path. I'm gonna tell you, go to this hop, this hop, this hop, and this hop. You can just see this may not end well. This may not end well. So quite a while back, routing header 0 was deprecated. Because why? Because it's extremely easy. In fact, I'll show you a packet that I crafted that does routing loops. As I say, I'm not going to say if it takes me 10 minutes or 15 minutes. Trivially, you can trivially create routing loops and all kind of different things with this particular thing. I'll show you that in the end, how I did that. And so there are other routing headers which are not deprecated. There's another whole, at some point at RFCs We Love or at another webinar, we should talk about Spring. There are some other source routing movements about, but that's, as I say, for a contained environment. But anyway, let me not distract on that. So here's some more. Here's the ESP header. This is for IPsec, and you can see then if you're going to have the encapsulating security payload, then after that your data is going to be encrypted. Here's one with AH only, the authentication header. Notice that the data itself is not encrypted because it's just authentication header. It's just saying, I trust that you are indeed who you say you are. I'm not saying that I'm encrypting the body. And notice how this one with AH is an OSPF packet. That's very, very interesting. So you could have a number of packets protected with IPsec. And having said that, I will say that a lot of enterprises steer clear of IPsec in IPv4 or IPv6, except in certain situations because of the problems with diagnostics, and it has to do with and the configuration. And I think in some ways that's why TLS has taken off so much more. It's because the configuration is quite a bit less. So here's AH and ESP. If you guys want to take a look at it, I'm just gonna leave this here for you to look at so that we can actually have some time for discussion too. So what are some of the issues with extension headers? Well, so and you'll hear a lot of our folks in the upcoming panels talk about some of these. Well, the issue has been, and some people have measured it and some people dispute it, is how much there is of dropping of IPv6 extension headers on the internet, and of what type, why is it happening? But if routers are going to drop extension headers, are they useful? And so it's an interesting question. And there are a number of studies being done on this whole area, and I actually want to do another study myself, because my own personal anecdotal experience of doing IPv6 extension headers across the internet leads me to different conclusions than what some of the other folks have presented. And we need to find out why, and I need to do a bigger study. So there's a lot of controversy about that, which you'll hear a great deal about. Whether that's happening on the internet, whether it's happening inside your enterprise, that's another whole question. And who's dropping stuff, why? The other thing has to do with performance. So things, big boxes, which are routing traffic, sending traffic on the internet, want to do it very fast. And how do you do it really fast? Well, you do it in the hardware. And so then you get into the whole size of, you're reading this thing into the ASIC, into your buffer. How big is it? And maybe you're parsing down to the TCP header, some such thing, to figure out how to route it, or how to do some fair weighted queuing or some such algorithm. How far are you parsing? And are you going to end up parsing it in the slow path? And so this whole thing, as I say, you'll hear a lot about the performance degradation that's possible because of extension headers. I'm summarizing what is an ongoing issue and has been an ongoing issue. I'm going to say for most of the last 5, maybe 10 years that at least I've known it. Anyway, maybe longer. There's another one. Another issue has to do with privacy violations. If you're sending out all this data, which is of use, well, things are not always just of use to you, the nice person at the end host, or the nice organization. It can also be of use to Mr. Bad Hacker and Mr. Bad Person or Ms. Bad Person who does not wish you well. And so there's privacy, potentially security aspects to this. Now, again, that's another whole thing. At some point, we'll have to do our encryption methodology. We are proposing an encryption methodology starting with our PDM extension header, and then ideally moving on to encrypt other extension headers as well. So that whole idea of, do we encrypt them? How do we do it? Is that a good idea? What's the most lightweight? That's another whole set of discussions that are being actively had. So another whole set of controversies is this whole thing of like, do we allow anybody along the path to look at, or heaven forbid, modify the extension headers, and what happens to packet integrity, packet size, and so forth once that happens? You know, to be honest with you, when I first heard about modifying things in the middle of the path, I was shocked, frankly shocked. I'm like, seriously, this is what we're doing here? Is we're going to modify things in midstream? I don't know. It just seemed kind of out of control to me. I could be, again, this is a very, very opinionated presentation. I'm not, it could be possibly done correctly and securely and safely. I don't know. I can certainly see a case for people being able to, middle boxes being able to look at things, but modifying, I don't know. I mean, I'd have to see the cases for that. Again, I'm pointing out all the controversies. Others on these panels will go into them at great length, I'm sure. And then the whole, we already talked about parsing of TLV, you know, potentially being too expensive. So the pros, of course, that we've talked about this all along, you know, extensible protocol extends the maturity of it. If you're interested, you may want to go take a look at PDM and PDM v2. It's a method for destination options to embed performance and diagnostic metrics within there, which is very, very useful for those of us who work at enterprises. There's a lot of other functionality that's being proposed. One that I thought was quite interesting was for source address validation. That is stopping spoofing. Somebody saying that I am this IP address when you're in no way, shape, or form that IP address. But that I would want that to be encrypted too. So they say we'll probably talk to them about encrypting that one. So let me close by giving you some reasons why people actually block these things, some valid reasons why people block them. It's quite easy to create malformed packets by manipulating headers. Very easy to craft packets that have incorrect or partial headers, violate the order, restrictions. And the other thing, for example, if you have something which does not drop packets silently, as it were, it's like if you have something like, for example, this one. This is a little bit old. It's like if you've got this not good packet, then you send an ICMP parameter problem code 2 to the packet source address. Now, if you have something like that, I can relatively easily craft a reflector attack that sends all these packets that have such a malformed thing and keep you super busy sending ICMP parameter problem. This is a nice little building block for a DOS attack. So, as I say, my life is completely misspent. So what I did was I crafted an IPv6 packet with multiple headers, deprecated headers, headers out of order, and making it all loop. I mean, just because a header is deprecated doesn't mean I can't craft it, right? And God only knows what the receiver of such a packet would do. And so we really need to think about security all along when we're doing this. So enjoy the next set of presentations. Dhruv, how am I doing on time? Any questions to folks? I mean, from folks? stop. Let me stop sharing.
You're doing quite well on time. We have time for questions. Folks, please don't be shy. Ask your questions. Even panelists, maybe unmute yourself and ask your questions.
If nobody else has a question, Nalini, this is Mike. Thank you for an excellent presentation. As an enterprise that doesn't know much about these EHs, this is extremely helpful. What if we need to know more or need to explore this in even more detail? Are there any alternatives other than calling you?
They can call you.
Then they'd be in real trouble.
Now, what are you thinking? Are you thinking like setting up a lab, some of our other presentations, or can you kind of elaborate or how would they do it themselves? What's your
thought? I think yes to all the above, but you're probably a couple steps ahead of me as usual. I think an enterprise person seeing this presentation would go, wow, there's a lot I need to learn about this. Are there classes? Are there experts we can talk to learn more? And then once we learn a little bit more, things like labs and testing and how this affects our networks in the real world and things like that. Because there seems to be a great amount of potential here, but also there's a great amount of potential things to worry about.
Yeah, that's really, really true. It's, you know what? I mean, okay. So, I think some of you guys may know that Mike and Dhruv and Mohit and Praneet, Priyanka, we've all been working on doing IPv6 training, and it seems to be quite well received. But, just even in this presentation that I did, there's probably about 20 different things that need to be explained a lot more. And then IPv6 security in and of its own, or like what all the different IPv6 extension headers and proposals are. I mean, it's hard to teach that because part of it too is like it's hard for us to keep up. And I know like what Mike and I do a lot of times is like, we can't, like when we go to the IETF, we can't go to both all sessions, so we have a conflict. He'll go to 6-man or V6 ops and I'll go to IPPM, and we'll come back and discuss at the end. And that's the only way we can kind of make sense of what's going on. And so guys, and I don't know what you had in mind, because we could teach, we could probably even teach a year on IPv6 security and migration. And I'm kind of thinking like the next set of webinars kind of be around that, because I'll tell you, for enterprises, the biggest thing that I hear is yeah, this all sounds good, but I don't want to get hacked. I don't want to have a DOS attack, because the minute something like that happens, they're going to back off and they're going to say, this is not working. And don't even get me started on like multicast. To cut to the chase here, what I did is that on one of the networks of one of the people who's implementing, even on this very webinar, I did a bunch of packet traces, and I'm kind of like, people are using these undocumented multicast addresses for what exactly? And these are like large tech companies, okay? And I'm not going to say who they are, but it's like, seriously, this is what's going on? And I'm telling you, it's like the minute you put, again, do not get me wrong, I'm like as bigoted a V6 proponent as you will find, but we need to do it safely and securely. So we probably need, and again, now I'm looking at Dhruv, is another whole series on multicast, V6 extension headers. What are the new things at IETF and security? We could really be teaching for the next 4 years. Am I answering your question at all, Mike?
Yeah, I was just about to say, I'm going to go back on mute. What you just said is exactly what I wanted to hear. You and Dhruv go work some more magic and we'll learn some more next year. and then we'll be ready to deploy IPv6 successfully. Because as you said, if we take off on this, we enterprises, if we take off on this and we're not successful, we will, as you said, back off for another series of years. I've joked saying decades, but unfortunately that's might not even be a joke. So yeah, the more education, the more we can learn, the better on this, because I think it's important. And I think it will lead to very successful networking in the future if we do pull it off. So thank you.
Well, yeah, no, thanks, Mike. And as I say, because if there's not questions, then I'm going to continue to blather on. Is one of the things that I really think that we need to do, and which we are working on with people. For example, there's 3 different U.S. federal agencies who have reached out to us in the U.S. government. And then we've got 2 universities and 1 Indian ministry in India. And I think what we want to do is start taking small steps. You know, the first one, do you have the right size address allocation? And then get a good address plan. And then the next step, all right, let's talk about how you're going to use this. And then in your lab, start doing some stuff. And then really understand security and go little by little by little. Because what we want to do in some senses is have deployment forums and work towards small controlled successes and everybody trade information. But in some ways, that kind of stuff works only if like is talking to like. And by that, what I mean, and I'll say in particular for our US federal agencies, they're not going to want to talk to people who are not other U.S. federal agencies. I mean, they'll talk to me and Mike and INTC because we're kind of a known quantity by now. And then, you know, people we say, but, you know, just anybody off the street, and rightfully so, why would they? It's like, and the same thing goes for banks, insurance companies, and so forth. So kind of our dream, and as I say, Dhruv, this is our dream now. I'm kind of teasing. It's like, I'm teasing. We have actually talked about this. Is deployment forums that are kind of going not vertically, but horizontally, like a cluster of banks talking together, cluster of universities talking together. You know, the Indian federals, the U.S. federals. I think, because there's a trust level, that needs to happen. This is very much not the IETF way, but I'm just being completely practical on what I think will work. I don't know. We'll have to try it out and see what happens. I don't know what any thoughts anybody has on this. And Dhruv, if I'm running out of time, cut me off. I'm blathering.
Just a little bit over, but that's okay. So thanks, Nalini. Thanks for a brilliant presentation and setting the scene. I've put the link of our past webinars on IPv6 for the chat for people who want to learn more on our past event. Give us suggestions on what you would like us to focus on so that we can use that feedback as well in our planning. So let's move to the next presentation. Next, I would like to introduce Geoff. Geoff, unfortunately, cannot be here in person. He has sent us the recording, so I will be playing that recording. We have a brilliant set of people as panelists today. So if you have questions, your questions will still be answered by Nalini, by Mike, by Eric, and all the other panelists which are here on today's call. So please don't be shy in asking your questions. So let me introduce Geoff. Geoff is the chief scientist in APNIC. He is well known in our community for doing a lot of interesting work on IPv6 deployment, routing behavior, DNS, network resiliency, and security. He has been involved in APNIC as well as in the past life in Australian ISPs. So he has a lot of information and he's just a brilliant person to listen to. So without wasting any more time, let me give it off to Geoff. Let me share sound, optimize for video, and here we go.
Second. Hello, hi, good morning, afternoon, whatever it might be. My name's Geoff Huston. I work with APNIC, and firstly, I must say I'm sorry I'm not with you in person. It seems to be so close to time to travel, but just not quite yet. So, unfortunately, it's video time. I do it live, but you know, it'll be 2 o'clock in the morning. And there are many things I can do at 2 o'clock in the morning. Actually, no, they're not. I only sleep at that time. So I'll record this instead. And today I want to talk about IPv6 and fragmentation. So let me share this screen and head on with a presentation pack. I'm sure most of you are aware that what we selected as V6, so many years ago, 94, I think, was actually the proposal that made the minimal amount of change to the existing V4 structure. So there are a small number of fields in the IPv4 header that changed, the identification field, the fragmentation control field, the protocol number. They all got moved out of the header, and in its place was the flow ID. So that was the summary of the changes, which seems relatively minor. To go into a little bit more detail, the original type of service field in V4 that, quite frankly, we never found a use for. Even, inserv and diffserv never quite got there. And ECN is still sort of partially implemented. So we've now changed this to traffic class because that'll be implemented so much better. Or not. We added a flow label, and then we never quite figured out why. To be perfectly frank, it's yet to find a useful role, if indeed it ever will. The header checksum was pushed down a layer, and all those other fields were actually replaced by chained extension headers. And so the packet ID and all those fragmentation controls, they became an extension header. And in some ways, that was big. Because if there's one thing that IPv4 had as an asset that no other protocol at the time really managed to do, it was adaptive control of the packet size. Because at the time, and I'm talking in the 1980s and even late 70s, each time we defined a new media layer, we kind of defined a range of packet sizes that were supported. Many of you are familiar with Ethernet, minimum size 64 bytes, maximum size 1500. But when we moved to FDDI, the maximum size was 4000 and so on. So if I'm going to build an inter-network that joins a FDDI network to an Ethernet network, what do I do with all those packets that have size 4000 octets? Well, in V4, it's kind of, well, that's easy. I will take out my handy packet slicer and dicer, and I will chop it up so that it fits into 1500 octet fragments, put the common IP packet header on all of them, set the fragmentation control bits, and send it on. Now, in V6, we changed that. We changed it to where those fragmentation control bits fit. They're in an optional extension header. No fragmentation, no extension header. And we changed who could do it. Routers were no longer allowed to do that adaptive slicing and dicing. When this FDDI packet hit that Ethernet segment and it was too big, the router in the middle said, oh, I've got a problem. And it sends an ICMP, a control message protocol, back towards the source saying, hey, don't send these packets that are that big. I know it's FDDI, but, keep your limit to 1500 and I'll just send them through. And so the whole idea in V6 was that fragmentation happened only at the source, and the control header was for fragmentation was in this optional extension header. Now, it had its problems. And when folks sort of seriously started to look at this, and yes, it took us a while, it took us, I hesitate to say it, but 20 years to actually start testing how well does this work in practice. RFC 7872 came out and actually tested V6 packets using some of these extension headers and looking at their success rate. And so they did fragmentation headers. They fragmented the packet down to 512 bytes and found that generally web, mail, DNS name servers, the drop rate was astonishingly high. 1 in 3, 1 in 2 packets got dropped. And, you know, the other options in V6, the so-called destination options and hop-by-hop options, were kind of a mixed result as well. Somewhere between 10 and 40% for the web servers, even worse for mail and worse for the DNS. So this is bad. Why is that drop rate so high? Well, for fragments, there's actually a double problem, because fragments were always seen as a bit of a conundrum for security, because the firewall likes to look one level deep and look inside the transport header. It looks at that protocol port number going, you seem to be doing electronic mail. You seem to be using port number 25, whatever. My rule says yes, or my rule says no. And so a lot of that sort of security control is based on the transport header. And if the fragment doesn't have a transport header, the trailing fragments, because they don't, you can either let them all through, that's a problem, or you can drop them. From a security view perspective, that's great. From a fragmentation perspective, it's kind of tough. And that's a problem. So fragments are always frowned upon. That whole IPv6 message back to the source, it's unvalidated, isn't it? Some random bozo off the network sends you a packet going, hey, that packet you sent was too big. Why should you believe it? Where's the credentials of the sender? It's just a random packet. And so for some reason, I think it's a good reason, ICMP is often just dropped as insecure, and I can understand that. And the other problem, of course, is extension header chains are about as bad as variably sized addresses in terms of architectures. Because as soon as you're doing a high-speed engine and some fields in the packet aren't at a known offset, you've got to follow a chain, then what I'm really saying is you've got to do multiple memory lookups. Now, memory hasn't really got that much faster. The cycle speed of memory, the clock times, haven't really changed for the last 10, 15 years. And if you're a high capacity switch and you're trying to deal with 100 million packets per second, that only gives you a few nanoseconds per packet. And if you're going to waste that doing 3, 4, 5, 6 memory lookups, you're going to start discarding packets everywhere. And so this idea of putting the transport protocol header at a variable sized offset from the protocol header was actually a tough place to put it, because that's just additional cycles and performance. And for many switches and routers and sort of transport sensitive devices in the middle of the network, the option was, I either want performance or I want to recognize extension headers. Customers buy performance. They don't really understand this extension header stuff. I'll drop them. And, guess what? They get dropped. Now, that measurement in RFC 7872 that detected this 25, 28% drop rate for fragments actually did it the other way. They sent fragmented packets towards servers and they observed whether the server responded or not. In other words, did you get my fragmented packet? But that's not what we do. We tend to send small packets to servers and the server sends a large response back. And it's the large response that's far more prone to fragmentation. So what we really should be doing is doing it the other way, trying to make the servers send back large packets and alter those servers such that they fragment or put in other kinds of extension headers. So let's try and measure that. Now, I can't change all the Alexa top, whatever servers. I can't. What I can do is set up my own server and enlist a whole bunch of clients to send them requests and then change the nature of the answer such that it includes fragments. And again, by observing the TCP flow, I can actually observe whether that packet gets ACKed if it's TCP, or if it's DNS and I'm sending back a large DNS answer, I actually tell whether the DNS answer was received or not. So that's the basic architecture of this experiment. We enlist a whole bunch of clients, and the way we do that is by using an online advertisement. We tend to send around 17 to 18 million advertisements a day across most of the internet. They ask for a web object or a DNS query. We generate that from a normal looking back end and then rang it through a packet fragmenter and actually dice with that response, and then look at the resulting packet capture to see whether the client got it, see whether they act it in either the protocol way in DNS or in TCP if we're using a web-based system. So we did this test in August 2017, and actually, oddly enough, the results were slightly better. We did 1.6 million experiments at the time and found a 21% drop rate compared to 28%, obviously getting better. We came back to this 4 years later when there's a whole lot more V6 because a huge number of deployments had happened between then and now. And we thought, right, let's set this up again, but let's do this all the time. Let's do this same experiment every day. Now, again, set up that dedicated middle box to fragment the outgoing packets and focus in particular, not on the DNS, but focus on TCP and the web, and detect the fact that you didn't get my fragmented packet when you fail to send me back a TCP acknowledgement for that segment, when the TCP session just comes to a screaming halt going, can't do it anymore. And just to test this out a little bit, let's not just always fragment at 1500 or 1280 or somewhere in between. Let's randomly pick a value between 1200 and 1416 octets for the size of that initial fragment. So let's fragment variably and see if size of the fragment has some impact on drop rates. I won't go into detail in the packet mangler design, but let me say that it was a bit of a nightmare. We're using libpcap to detect packets coming in, and that's fine, but it has no buffers. And so you've got very limited time when you're doing a large amount of traffic to actually find the packet, process the packet, and send it on. And so we actually ended up using a whole multi-process situation of doing shared ring buffers. We actually built a complete V6 NAT in the middle of all this. And so we set up a NAT state for incoming packets, and for outgoing packets, we push it through a NAT mangler from that shared NAT state, and also a packet fragmenter that does that, pick a random size and fragment it. And here's the answers. Now, at the start of this year, our experiment platform dropped off the twig a bit, and that data that's shaded isn't reliable data. But over a period of a little over 12 months, the world's average fragmentation drop rate actually got worse for a while, and then has slowly and surely over the last part of 2021 up until today has been slowly and surely getting better. Now, underneath this, you've actually got to understand that right now there's an enormous number more V6 users than there were even a year ago. So in other words, the pool of people being tested is actually increasing rather than decreasing. And so right now, the drop rate today is around 7.5%, as you see in that blue line. If we look at it by country, what you actually find is India is good. A lot of V6 and handling it very well. Parts of the Middle East, amazingly good. Some of the earlier deployments, not so good. France, even Germany, Sweden. And Brazil, again, an early V6 adopter, average, nothing brilliant. So there's a lot of variation, but there's one thing that I suppose should be brought out. The more recent the deployment, the better the numbers. So the more recent equipment that we're fielding in the ISP world seems to handle fragments a whole lot better. Now, I said before that we were varying the fragment size. And so let's look at the drop rate by fragment size. And this is the astonishing surprise, because once we get up over 1370 octets, the drop rate goes from around 8 7-8%, up to an astonishing 15%. Huh? That wasn't meant to happen. And when I look at it and divide the world into, are you in America, in Europe, in Asia, then oddly enough, the profile is somewhat different. Europe's kind of bad. Asia also is kind of bad. If you look at Asia, like Europe, the larger packets, it goes all the way up to a 30% drop rate. Whereas America is more even. It's still quite high, but it's more even across the sizes. Why? Well, I think we're assuming that every ISP is the same, and they're not. If you're a customer of TELUS in Canada, you don't get fragments. You just don't. Look at that blue line. It's a 95% drop rate. I think the only folk who are actually able to do some kind of fragmentation are the residual folks still using some kind of legacy V6 tunneling in V4 that supports some kind of fragment facility. Because at native mode, TELUS, everything gets dropped. Whereas a massive deployment in India, Bharti Mobile, which has literally hundreds of millions of customers, has an astonishingly low drop rate at around 4%. Yes, it's getting slightly worse over time, but it's still much better than the world average and still astonishingly low. So it varies a lot by provider. But why else are large packets fragmented? Well, local security policies, maybe. There is this whole issue that extension headers might not be processed in the fast path. And when you go to the slow path, the queues are a lot shorter and the possibility of drop gets a whole lot higher. So large packets encounter a higher drop rate because of slow path processing. Possible. There's this whole issue of path MTU woes. Yes, there is. And I'm kind of also thinking about TCP MSS settings. And the folk that actually receive these large fragments are the folk that set optimistic values for their TCP MSS. And if that value is actually too optimistic, yes, I can handle 1500 octet packets, but in actual fact, you can't. It means that when I try to hand you a large fragment, that packet gets dropped because of MTU. So this whole issue of what am I seeing needs a little more investigation, but it's certainly true pragmatically that the probability of loss increases quite dramatically on average once you get over around 13, 20 octets in packet size. Moral of the story, keep your MSSs low and you'll avoid the problem. Now, I'm kind of wondering, and I think you should be too, is this fragmentation? Or is this new model of extension header handling in V6? So is it the fact that we've pushed the transport layer down by a certain amount inside this packet and shoved a fragmentation shim in the middle? Or is it just fragmentation? So we then use the technique of what we call an atomic fragment. So we still use that shim, but it says the actual complete packet is just below. So the fragment offset is 0 and the more bit 0. So what it says is, here is a packet and the fragmentation shim header is just filler. It means nothing. And we want to see the drop rate. Now, I'll go back to that original plot that I showed you of day by day. But now, let's have a look at that red line. Because the red line is the drop rate for atomic fragments. And what we're actually finding is atomic fragments tend to have a drop rate these days of around 6%. And so increasingly it seems maybe the problem is in the extension header, not in fragments per se. Either that or the firewall rules that say, I hate fragments, is so undiscerning and primitive, it simply goes, if there's a fragmentation extension header, just drop this stuff. I don't care if it's an atomic fragment or not. I don't believe it, which seems a bit crude, but, there's a lot of banging the rocks together in networking. So crudity does prevail in a lot of equipment and configs. When we look around the world, again, we see very, very big differences. In Germany, average for all of Germany, the V6 folk there, the atomic fragment drop rate's about the same as the conventional fragmentation drop rate. In Italy, the atomic fragment drop rate is tinsy tiny compared to everything else in normal fragments. And in Australia, the atomic fragment drop rate is higher. Huh? I'm getting confused at this point. It's not as if there are so many different providers of V6 equipment out there. The set of equipment vendors that sell you equipment is actually quite small, and they might do variations in behavior, but these variations are quite dramatic country by country, and probably network by network. And so there's not a consistent story out there about drop rates. You know, sometimes it seems to be the network infrastructure just objecting to extension headers. Sometimes it may well be at the edge objecting to the fact there are fragments. Hard to tell. But this atomic frag data didn't really tell us what we wanted to know. Is it fragments or is it extension headers? So the next thing we looked at is to see what other extension headers are out there. And there are two more that look pretty interesting. We want an extension header that doesn't actually require a behavior, an extension header that just is. And one of them is the destination option padding. Now, in theory, you're meant to have some kind of destination option, a signal to the other end going, I want this packet treated a certain way, here's some additional information, whatever. And you'd like to pad that up to basically a multiple of eight octets to make the offsets all work. And so there's a certain filler that simply goes, I'm just padding, ignore me. So what if we send the destination option that's just, I'm just padding, ignore me. Now, at this point, it looks good because the pad end doesn't do anything. It doesn't rely on any functionality in the host. The network shouldn't actually look at it because it's meant for the end host. So, you know, move along, nothing to see. And so this signaling should just work. And when it gets to the other end host, here's the destination option, but it doesn't say anything. The answer should be fine. Just ignore it and process the packet as normal. Good in theory. What about in practice? Whoa! 94.5% drop rate. That's bad. And when you get a drop rate like that, and don't forget, way back in 2014, what they measured for destination options was somewhere between 10 and 20% drop rate. They did not measure 94.5% drop rate. Something's going on. Now, most hosts don't like extension headers by the look of it, or most networks don't like delivering them, or both. So in some ways, this is a very recent finding, January. We haven't done too much work in trying to look under the hood to find out what's going on, because that's a bad number, but exactly what's going on is still speculation at this point. So let's try again. What if this is all about hosts dropping destination options? Is there another option? Well, yes, there is. It's the same padding option, but this time it's on the hop by hop. Hey, router, if you understand extension headers, look at me. I want you to do nothing. Because the padding option. And so I'm not asking for any special hop by hop treatment. I'm simply saying, this has got an extension header. Do you like this? And so again, no special processing is being asked for. Should work, right? Right? It's worse. 99.5, you kind of go, if I'd have written a packet dropper, you know, it wouldn't be so much different. Everyone doesn't like this option. Most hosts, most routers, somewhere along the line, this is being dropped. So awesomely better. Now, what do we learn from all this? Because this is kind of interesting. The first thing is, slowly and very slowly, we are getting better slightly at handling fragmented V6 packets. It's gone from unusably bad to, you know, tolerably poor. Still not very good. And, you know, the most pragmatic advice to anyone is don't fragment. But more recent deployments are a little bit more robust in handling fragments than older deployments. And destination extension headers and hop-by-hop extension headers, well, you're dreaming. You're just dreaming. If you're talking about the public internet, these are alien concepts. Public internet, extension headers. Don't play. Do not play together. What have we learned about fragmentation? In V6, the answer is you can't, you shouldn't, don't do it. Don't rely on path MTU discovery. Don't rely on extension headers. Don't rely on IPv6. Just don't. And so if you're setting up a V6 service, pick your MSS in TCP and your MTU size carefully. If you want to go conservative and make sure everything squeezes through, pick 1280. Yes, I know it's a rubbish number and it really doesn't mean anything. But if you want to steer clear of icebergs that destroy your packets, 1280 is a pretty robust choice. If you're worried about that ratio of payload size to header size and you want something a little bit more efficient, you could probably push it as high as 1350 and it would still be survivable. The Goldilocks choice, if it's not too small, but certainly not big enough to encounter problems. Don't go above that, because even as once you get to 1400, the drop rates start increasing as a likelihood of failure. And oddly enough, 1500 is a poor choice, because there's a whole bunch of other middleware equipment that sort of goes, don't like this. Even though 1280 didn't mean anything and 1350 doesn't mean anything, for some reason we've installed a whole bunch of other stuff in the network that actually does do dropping around 1360, 1380 and higher that it shouldn't be doing. But nevertheless, it is. You can either pick a fight with them, try and identify each one and clean up this problem. More power to you, but you're going to fail. Or you can set up your own server stacks and client stacks to go, look, if I use 1350, I don't have to fight this fight. It'll just work a whole lot better. And my advice is 1350 is a good answer for quick, for TCP, for anything else. Keep it low, it will probably work. And the lessons learned about hop-by-hop extension headers and destination extension headers, that's easy. Don't use them. They just don't work. As I said at the outset, when we set this thing up a year ago, instead of just running it for a week or so and collecting some data and reporting back, we thought, it might be useful to actually chart progress. And so I do every day. And this URL actually gives you a picture. And the picture is every country, every day. Let me then look at a live view. So we'll stop that sharing and move somewhere else and actually look at what the situation looks like today. Let me now share this screen. And here's what we see as the map of the world today. But we can actually look down further and actually look at, well, how about Oceania? Okay, here's some graphs for how we're doing in my part of the world. How about Australia? There's that atomic fragment. The drop rate's quite high. Real fragments, the drop rate's far lower. Who's doing this? Well, if I actually look at which providers have a large market share in V6, the dominant one, and yesterday, 158 sample points, is AS1221, Telstra. I used to work for them. Let's have a look at Telstra as an individual provider. Overall, their fragmentation drop rate for Telstra customers has been consistent between around 5 to 10% drop rate for the last 12 months. The variations are relatively minor. They might have done something recently in the last few weeks. Hard to tell, it's recent data. The atomic fragment drop rate, they did something in October. They did a software change somewhere in their infrastructure. Atomic frags are bad, let's drop the lot. And so their drop rate for atomic frags is well up around 22.5. look for your own provider, look for wherever you might be. That web page actually wanders down through every country and every major autonomous system and actually gives you current up-to-date stats on this area of performance of fragmentation and survivability. So that's all I have for this presentation. I will get up at impossibly silly hour of the morning, and if you have any questions, who knows, I might even be awake to answer them. Thank you very much.
That was an excellent food for thought from Geoff. Are there any questions, or maybe what we can do is we can merge those questions with the panel so that, like, panel could answer if you have questions related to this presentation. I have one question and I would rather save it for the panel. So let's move to the next topic. I hope that's okay with everyone. And next, what we have is a panel discussion on IPv6 extension header. I'm sure that Geoff's talk would have been very thought-provoking, and you would have some questions on the viability of extension headers. And now what we have done is we have a really great set of panelists, and I would let our moderator for the day, which is Vyncke, introduce them. And let me just welcome Eric. Thanks, Eric, for moderating this session. Eric is the Internet Area Director at IETF. He has been involved with IPv6 for a long time. Like Geoff, Eric also has been measuring the IPv6 deployment and things for the long time. So I would like to hear his his ideas over the measurement that Geoff has versus what Justin and Eric have been doing. And without waiting, let's give it off to Eric to make further introduction for the panelists.
Okay, thank you, Dhruv, for the introduction. And we have prepared a couple of bio for all the panelists. And by the way, I would love to thank Ron, Darren, Justin, and Mike and Fernando to join myself as a panelist here. There's really a great set of talents here that are all together. So we already know Ron, and nice to turn your video on, Ron. That's nice to see your face. So hello, same for you, Darren, for the video. So Ron was speaking yesterday anyway. He's a distinguished engineer at Juniper. I know him forever at the IETF. You must really join the IETF before myself. I joined, I think, at the IETF 49. Many RFC. He's been as well an Ops area director for a couple of years. He's the co-chair of V6 Ops and IPsec, two working groups that are close to my heart. And he works for Juniper. Darren is a colleague of mine. He works at Cisco, he's based in Canada and works for the enterprise and service provider solution, mainly on the routing, where he's an architect over there. His recent focus is on segment routing, and I don't think we talk about segment routing until now, but segment routing is basically using an extension header, the routing header, in a specific way. And Ron has also got some focus on this as well, so could be interesting to see the different point of view, if any, on this. And so Darren is also many RFCs, including segment routing. Next slide. So Mike already asked the questions on Nalini talk because they work together all the time. At least I know them because they joined the IETF with one very specific problem or suggestions a couple of years ago. And since then, I got the pleasure to meet Mike mostly at each and every IETF. Mike will bring to the panel his expertise as an enterprise, because obviously Ron and Darren are more on the vendor side, but people are using it. So we need to know as well what's an enterprise, what they are doing. And I think I would be also very eager to understand what enterprise are doing with extension headers. So he works at the Blue Cross Blue Shield in Michigan. He has been responsible for the IT there. The another panelist is Justin. I know him very well. We are in the same city, and both of us are pilots, small plane pilots, right? So we are in the air, but we try to keep the feet on the ground. He's a PhD student at the university, doing a lot of things, including Linux kernel for in situ OAM. And recently, he is starting sponsoring or helping mentoring a master student doing his master thesis on extension headers propagation over the internet. And I think, Justin, you may want to say some few words later on this. Next slide. The other panelist is Fernando Gont, who just joined. So Fernando, hi again. Is currently the Director of Information Security of Edge Uno out of Argentina and other countries. Edge Uno is basically a big hosting provider and service provider in those countries. Before he worked mainly in security for UK and other as a contractors. He wrote multiple RFCs, mainly around IPv6 and security. He also did an RFC about measuring the fragmentation and the extension header drop over the internet. So it would be nice to get his point of view. And we got the pleasure to talk in some events like the German IPsec Congress, where we are speaking together, as well as in Troopers in Germany and maybe others. And myself, and Dhruv was nice enough to introduce myself, so avoiding the shame of introducing myself on the panel. The rule of the panel, there are no rules basically, right? So I have prepared a couple of questions that I think address all the big things regarding extension headers. But of course, all the normal participants and the panelists, you can interrupt me anytime and ask questions through the Q&A. And Dhruv, as I am focusing mainly on the panel, if you see questions, feel free to interrupt this. Okay, so the first questions, and on this one, I think I would ask all the panelists to give their point of view in 2-3 minutes. What are the current and future use of extension headers? So what are the extension headers? Anyone? And some of them are pretty obvious that are used correctly over the internet, and maybe not so much for the others. And I will ask for everyone, and maybe I will start, because I see this on the video. Can we stop sharing, Dhruv, so we can see each other video? So on my screen, on the top, I see Darren. So Darren, if you want to start, what do you see as the good use?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's a lot of documented uses for extension headers, and as Geoff had mentioned, you know, a good number of those maybe don't work over the internet, or work to limited extents. And I think that, you know, what Geoff had presented is a great bit of information, and I would love to dig further into what's going on there in some of those cases, especially what's happening with TELUS in Canada. That seems pretty bizarre. So some of the good uses of current uses of extension headers that I think are you know, promising and are good at the moment is, you know, obviously the work in SRE6 on the SRH, I think is getting good traction in limited domains and provider networks. Mike, maybe we can talk more about enterprise networks and you know, uses in enterprise networks at some point. So I think that's an excellent use. The hop by hop option header is I guess much maligned, not terribly well loved. I'm wondering if it might get a little more use in OAM use cases. That might be coming up. I'm interested to see what happens there. We all know that ESP works. It's kind of another forgotten extension header that, you know, works everywhere, right? So extension headers do work over the internet, and they work every day for a lot of people. Some of them don't, and it's interesting to understand why. But I think I'll let the rest of the panelists give their couple minutes now and see what other thoughts are.
So in my list of people on my screen, Ron, you are the next. You are muted, Ron.
Yeah.
At least I don't hear you.
Okay. I guess there are two questions embedded in your question. One is, what are the good uses of extension headers out on the global internet? And the other is, what are the good uses of extension headers in limited domains? Let's talk about the first, out on the global internet.
And by the way, we will go more on the differentiation later. So just be brief. We will focus on this topic much more later, if you don't mind. Because it's important indeed.
In the global internet, probably the ESP is the only one that is used successfully. The others have a hard time getting from end to end. They're not reliable enough to know that you're going to get from here to there. Now the question is, can any of them be rehabilitated, and should any of them be rehabilitated? That's probably where we should be putting our effort in the next couple of years in the IETF, figuring out which should be rehabilitated, which should not, and how they need to change to be rehabilitated. As for in limited domains, we have a much bigger argument about whether IPv6 is really an underlay technology or an overlay technology. That's probably for a different session.
Okay. Thank you, Ron. Mike?
Hi, everyone. I'm the dumb enterprise guy, and I come from a completely different perspective than everybody else, more than likely. As everybody probably knows, enterprises are not deploying IPv6. We have lots of excuses, reasons. One of them is that we are concerned about these bigger, more complex, more powerful networks and our ability to manage and secure them. And that's a big concern. We're not sure how that's going to be done, and that creates something that we like to call gaps. And if there are gaps, we will probably not deploy IPv6. So there is some hope, I think, and that's in extension headers and the management capabilities, information they can provide. And some of those have been outlined already, like HVH, PDM. I don't think we talked about IOAM. We did talk about segment routing. So there's great hope there. But, and there's always a but, extension headers also, as outlined, have their own issues. And those have been talked about, but just to say them really briefly, is that they're getting dropped in some cases, as I listened to Geoff Huston, at very alarming rates. They create performance issues, whether they can be modified in flight or not, and what kind of issues those cause, MTU sizes and fragmentation issues that result. And a big one for us that hasn't been addressed a tremendous amount today is security issues, in particular privacy surrounding extension headers. That is a huge mandate for most large enterprises. So those are some of the issues. What I'm hopeful that we can talk about today is ways that we can address some of those issues and make extension headers viable and valuable to enterprises and others. And I'll also highlight what Ron tried to just start talking about, that some of the answers might be different within our domain and across the internet and in various network situations in general. So thanks for conducting this, Eric and Dhruv and IPsec.
And thanks for joining. So Justin, as we are still following my order of video, what do you think are the current use and future use of extension headers?
Well, I think it has already been summarized, but from a limited domain point of view, I think that right now we already see the trend, because in the IETF, for instance, you see more and more drafts trying to define some new code points in a limited domain context. So, and it's quite different for a global internet in that case. Obviously, some, not all, but some extension headers are not well supported. And I don't think it could improve just like that. Maybe we need a need or some needs. And so maybe operators will follow, I don't know. But I'm not sure that right now what the IETF is trying to do will we'll change the things directly like that.
Okay, thank you, Huston. Fernando?
Hi guys, can you hear me properly?
Loud and clear.
Thanks so much. So, from my perspective, if you look at, the topic of IPv6 extension headers, it's not that different from what happened with IP options, okay? So essentially the options were there actually probably, in the case of IP options, they actually work better than IPv6 extension headers at the time or for quite a while. But what happened is that there was essentially not the good use case for them for a long time. Not that there couldn't be a use case, but there wasn't a good use case, for quite a long period of time, and that meant that in deployed devices, that was normally code that wasn't well exercised, meaning that it was prone to have a lot of bugs. Okay, if you look at vulnerability advisories associated with IPv6, I would argue that quite a lot of them have to do with extension headers, okay? And that led to a situation in which if you were, operating the network, whether, no matter what kind of network that was, well, if you didn't have a good, a good use case for, the feature, no matter what the feature was, and it had a lot of associated issues and nobody was asking for the feature, well, the way to go was, quite clear. Nobody's asking for it. It's something that brings you trouble. What you do, of course, you drop. Okay, that's the obvious choice of that. Now, unfortunately, when you get into a situation in which that's regular practice already, it's kind of like the cat is out of the bag already. So can you actually go back? Can you actually, talk to operators and say, well, you have had like all these issues for quite a long time, and are you willing to open up your network, maybe probably be exposed to things that you wouldn't be exposed if you were dropping this, just for the possible case in which you might have a good case? Normally, and unfortunately, the answer is no. So I would believe that when it comes to use cases, I mean, there's room for lots of use cases. They have been mentioned, like in limited domains, because your network, your rules. But when you think about the public internet, I am, let's say, I don't know if the word would be pessimistic or realistic, but I see it as quite unlikely that the situation is going to improve significantly over time.
Okay, thank you. Another thing, and I see the comment from Tony Lee as well as a question. Before discussing among us about the propagation and the drop rate of all those extension headers in different pieces, because as Ron, you said, the situation is very different between limited domain, the global internet, and like you said, Mike, in the enterprise. I would love, took two notes while you were responding and answering at these first questions. One was one point of view that you said, Ron, about rehabilitating, basically putting back in power some extension header. Can you give us a hint of what you are thinking about?
Okay. Well, first, I totally agree with Fernando. An extension header without a use case is a security vulnerability and nothing else. But slowly but surely, we're finding reasons to rehabilitate one extension header or another. For instance, this is the use case that I love. Somebody needs a few more diff-serve bits. You have two choices: to steal bits from other fields in the base IPv6 header. That's clearly a bad idea. Or rehabilitate the hop-by-hop extension header. Well, the hop-by-hop extension header, as it's defined now, is just a bit dangerous. It can be as long as 2K, which, Lord knows what most routers will do when they hit a 2K hop-by-hop extension header. So if we constrain what a hop-by-hop extension header can look like, we may be able to rehabilitate it so that it can be implemented and deployed across the internet for some very, very constrained use cases. Now, does that mean we're going to rehabilitate every extension header? No. Does it mean the extension headers will look the way they do today? No. But maybe we'll get a little mileage out of them.
Okay, thank you. And I don't remember who talked about it, and maybe it was you, Mike, about the use case of IOAM. And Justin, as far as I know, part of your thesis is about implementing IOAM. Can you say a few words on this?
Yeah, so Mike mentioned the up by up for IOM. So this is really what we've used. And this is available in the kernel and I think in VPP as well. So this is the way we've used for to transport IOM.
Okay, so it looks like the hop by hop could be used to extend the IPv6 header and process on each and every hop on the path. That's basically what Ron and Justin are hinting to, and future will tell, obviously. Now, just before this panel, we get a discussion with Geoff Huston where he was checking measurement, basically from handset and PCs towards some server and making some analysis. And Fernando, you did the same thing. And Justin, you are doing another kind of study. So I would like to get now thinking and getting the point of view of the panelists. How realistic is it to rely in 2020 or maybe in 3 years from now on extension header to convey some semantics across the network or through the network? And I will start first with the global internet. And then I will ask more about the enterprise, and it will be for you, Mike, be ready, and more for the limited domain, like a data center, for instance. And if you don't mind, I will ask the last questions about the limited domain to Ron and Darren. And of course, at the end, everyone can say something. So let's start globally. And if you don't mind, Fernando, I will start with you as you make a study on this with an RSC 7872 with Tim and Jen about 6 years ago. So what was the situation at that point of time? And do you think something has changed?
Yeah, so let me first provide some background. So the study that we did, it started because there was a discussion on, I think it was the B6 Ops working group about the fragments being dropped. Okay, but I was seeing no data, and I say, okay, well, everyone is talking about the fragments being dropped, but how often are they dropped? So I essentially started building tools for that, and I realized that it was, at the end of the day, the work being done, it was the same to measure just fragments or just measure arbitrary extension headers like destination options and so on. So when I started with some preliminary measurements, not the more complete measurements that we did afterwards, and I got some preliminary results for, I must say, for at least 3 days. I was reviewing the tools because I expected the results to be much better. And I assumed that there was some sort of bug in the tools that I was using for the measurements. That was the reality, to be honest. And then, after reviewing for a while, well, there was no bug in the tools. The results were what they were. Okay, so which were, bad enough. There were some things that we didn't publish, which are a little bit concerning, which, we talk about destination options, we talk about host by hop options and so on. But one extension header that we did measure, but we didn't publish the results about, are IPsec, and they do get dropped too. So sometimes we forget, like, about IPsec. We assume that always is proper extensions, so to speak. But IPsec, which is an extension header too, does get dropped too in the public internet with a similar rate as other extension headers. I must say, when we did this study, years ago, I didn't have much expectations for the situation to get, much better or much worse. So for me, that was like, well, they are not really able, and that's bad, you could say. And let me say, when I just saw, Geoff results on, what the evolution has been, it's actually, I don't know how to describe that. Like, it actually got much worse than I expected, to be honest. But in a way, it's understandable, because you could say that, as IPv6, gets more and more deployed and people get more experience with it, and, they get more knowledge about it, as unfortunate as it might be, again, when you look at extension headers, for example, from the point of view of an operator, most of the stuff that you see is that most of the vulnerability advisories affecting, vendors, whether that's router vendors, general operating systems, are associated with extension headers. So in a way, it's no surprise that people got into this conclusion that, well, there's nothing that we are doing with it, and actually that's the source of a lot of problems. Now, we could certainly, let's say, we could hope. I mean, we can always hope that the situation, might get better. Now, I would say, like with many things, once we are in a situation in which people normally associate something with problems, it's kind of like difficult. And even if we were, to try to get into that path, I'm concerned about the time frame. Let's say we want to rehabilitate like some specific extension header for the public internet. Limited domains, different thing. But I wonder, what the time frames would be. And, unfortunately, and this is something that, happens, in regular operations, when you have a feature that you could potentially use or possibly use, but what you get is unreliability, unfortunately, you switch to something else. You do tunnels with certain features,
Fernando,
they don't work. Yeah.
So let's push on the discussion about what's happening for later, because I would really want to see what's happening about the drop rate and the propagation success over the global internet. So it was not very fantastic. You told us 6 years ago, and Geoff told us it doesn't seem so much better right now. So Justin, you made a kind of a different measurement recently with the student. So what are your results there?
Sorry?
So Justin.
Yeah.
Asking and so switching basically to panelists to get everyone's point of view and there.
Eric, would you like that I share my screen to show some slides? Maybe it will be easier to.
If you have numbers on the slide, yes, please. Quickly.
Yes, I have some. Can you see them?
Yeah.
All right, so I will just skip directly. Yeah, so basically this is the kind of topology we've used. So we have VMs all around the world, and we are probing each pair of VMs. And so,
and by the way, the VM, if you see the VM in Argentina, this is thanks to Fernando Gont. So thank you, Fernando, for this one.
Thank you. Yeah. So back to the results. So for the hop by hop, this is kind of the same that Geoff said. They don't go through, so it's hardly usable. About the destination option, actually, it's a little bit better as long as you don't exceed a specific length. So if you see here for 8 and 16, it goes through, but it starts a little bit to drop once you have a size of 32, and it's half the size for 64. So we are planning to add some pair of 2 sizes here in between to see exactly how it happens and maybe why. About the routing headers, we have almost all going through except for the 0 and the type 4, which are basically type 0 is deprecated and type 4 is segment routing. So this is not a big surprise here. For the fragments header, we tested both atomic and non-atomic, and actually the non-atomic goes through while the atomic don't go through. 70% goes through, sorry. And we also tested some special cases with no next header, it goes through, and with the Ethernet as the next header, and it goes through. We also tested, it's not on this slide, but we tested the authentication header, and it goes through as well.
Okay, thank you, Justin. So all those measurements were over the global public internet, so crossing multiple AS and multiple operators. And in some cases, I guess what Justin has seen in his draft is that the tier 1 AS, so the one that really at the deep core of the internet, are basically free flow for most of the extension headers, but it's more on the edge that the packets are dropped because they are consuming most probably those extension headers and not simply forwarding them. So talking about the end user, so it leads us to one enterprise. So Mike, do you know about what customers in the or enterprise networks are doing extension headers in IPv6?
Should I just stay on mute?
Sorry to put you on the spot.
As I said, as I said earlier, we're for the most part not deploying IPv6, and I see, I'm one of the evangelists that say, hey guys, we should be doing this. And then they say, well, why? And EHs and the information it can provide and the management capabilities that it can provide are one of the reasons that have us at least looking at it. So we're not ready to come to the table with results yet, but the results that others are collecting, such as Geoff Huston, are very alarming to us. So I'd like to see us as a community look into that more deeply, do more studies, more granular, more complete, perhaps on a wider scale. As a couple of the panelists have said, separating the results by domain and pursuing things along that path, getting to maybe more details in terms of what the causal factors are, and then seeing what we can do about that as a community. I think there's some work along those lines going on in 6Man now, and that's very inspiring to me. So those are the kind of things that I think enterprises would like to see happening. Unfortunately, I don't think we bring a lot to the table in helping there, but we'll try where we can. Just knowing the limitations are that we'll be able to provide requirements and how this would react in a corporate network, especially one that might interface with the internet. So we can participate in that way. But Eric, I know I avoided your question, like what we're doing and what we're seeing now is almost nothing.
Okay. So, and by the way, if you allow me to be a panelist for a while, the moderator, I've helped some customers to deploy IPv6 universities, notably, and our internal network. And there is a free flow of all the extension headers. There is no security policies applied within the network, right? Obviously, at the edge, that's vastly different. And the same thing, the edge, including the access network. Just two, three examples there. So now let's focus more on something which is less generic. This is what we call limited domains. And there are 4 billion people over the earth, or 6, I don't remember, but there are most probably 6 billion definition of limited domain. Okay, at least we have 6 panelists, and there are most probably 6 different definitions of what a limited domain is. But for some definition of limited domain, it's basically a control zone, so within an administrative or an operational domain. So I would love to ask you, Ron, what's your point of view? How can we use and rely on extension headers within a limited domain? And feel free to redefine limited domain for your sense.
Okay. First, I'd like to take issue with something you said, that we have 6 panelists and 6 definitions of limited domain. I have 2 definitions, so we have at least 7. But let's talk about first whether a limited domain actually exists. A limited domain, by most folks' definition, has something to do with the ability to firewall it off from the rest of the global internet. And I wonder if any limited domains actually exist. For a limited domain to stop being a limited domain, one of 2 things can happen. Either somebody leaves something off a firewall, one edge is unprotected, and what you thought was a limited domain is not. And another way it can happen is some host inside the limited domain becomes compromised, in which case what you think is a limited domain is not. So I can see Fernando furling his eyebrows as a security guy. He's probably thinking, oh my God, what I think is a limited domain probably isn't. The question is whether you ever have one. So let's talk about how you might use extension headers in a limited domain. One possibility is that what you actually want to do is use IPv6 as an underlay technology in a limited domain. What does that mean? You're carrying some payload, maybe IPv6, maybe something else, over IPv6, and doing magic in that limited domain with extension headers. Now, the question is, do we have any magic that needs to be done that cannot be done with an other underlay technology that we've invented years ago? And it again comes to what Fernando said. is the potential benefit great enough to justify the security risks? And you know, that remains to be seen on a case-by-case basis. So you know, I'm thinking maybe routing headers if people decide that they want to do routing, do traffic engineering with IPv6 as opposed to MPLS. Maybe hop-by-hop extension headers if they need something like more diff-serve bits or virtual topology identifiers. But it remains to be seen on a case-by-case basis. It's all about the killer application.
Okay, thank you. Darren, anything to add on the limited domain use of extension headers?
Sure. I mean, certainly routing header and hop by hop seem like good uses within a limited domain as long as you're able to define the edges of your domain. And the kind of killer app or killer use case is of course the thing that drives it. You know, there wasn't IPv6 adoption until a couple things happened. So in other words, people just didn't go out and say, hey, IETF came up with some new cool thing that's bigger and bigger and I don't really need it, so I'm not going to deploy it, right? That's what happened initially back in 2000. But then as there was the need and as we saw with, I think, Bob's presentation yesterday, a need for it because we wanted to get capabilities out of IPv6. It was improved and it was deployed and it was adopted. And we've seen from 2015 to now some big improvements in the deployment and use of IPv6. I think the same applies to extension headers in general across the internet. You know, what's the use? What's going to drive them? What are people getting out of them? And certainly within a limited domain, I think that's kind of like well fertilized, right? Or it's kind of it's fertile ground for the innovation and the development in a setting that can be controlled by an administrator, a set of administrators. So I think that we do see uses in the low power space with RPL for routing, SRH for SRv6. The hop by hop ones, like I say, are going to be interesting. And I believe the security issues. I don't know if I call them security, but certainly securing that domain or protecting it from attack is something that all operators always need to do with their domains, with their infrastructure. And I think that is going to evolve as those use cases bring in enough revenue or save enough money.
Okay, thank you. So all the panelists have given their point of view regarding the success rate, let's say, or the lifetime of or the usefulness of extension headers. Nalini, you get the questions. Would you mind to say it, or do you want me to repeat it? Okay, for the sake of time, I will read it. So it has been in the Q&A. Quoting Nalini, we've been there before. IPv4 options were slow path, performed poorly, and no one wanted to use them. And as far as I know, nobody used them. Given that Geoff has shown us extension headers are headed down the same path, why not just deprecate them right now? And whoever in the panel, feel free to reply on this.
Okay, I can
thank
answer
you for your question, by the way.
I can answer on the deprecation part. Let's say that's not the most pleasant thing to do for a group that was tasked to make something work. That doesn't change reality, but I would say that normally from the point of view of the group that created a feature, no matter what, there's always the hope or the intention that the feature can eventually be made to work. And I can give you a concrete example. Like we recently, for some meaning of recently, we work on this document with Ron and a few other folks on fragmentation being fragile, right? So when you go through the document, the obvious outcome is, well, we should deprecate fragmentation and not use it, right? But that wasn't actually that outcome isn't actually in the document, okay? And that's probably a good example to the extent that where that option of deprecating the feature might fly. There's the other thing, which it's something that has been changing recently, for some meaning of recently. For example, in the IETF, that normally the view was that whatever we would, let's say, features we would include in a protocol such as IPv6 had to be like features that were usable or could survive the public internet. And in a way, there is some kind of acceptance that is no longer the case, that there are some parts of the protocol that you might expect to work everywhere and other parts of the protocol that you might not. It's not really clear, what are the environments where, it's not really clear where exactly you could expect them to work, but I would say that there's an implicit acceptance that, okay, this is not going to work for the public internet, but let's keep it because we might have some limited domain scenario where we could make, use of it.
I could jump in and add to this.
Go on, Ron.
To some extent, I agree with Tony. There are a few extension headers that I think should be deprecated. And if it doesn't work, we should just admit it, throw it out, and not have fantasies in the RFC series. But I don't think we should throw out the baby with the bathwater quite yet. For instance, the hop-by-hop extension header that we have today may be impractical. Maybe we need to trim it down so it can be no more than 16 bytes or 32 bytes or something like that. And maybe we need an acceptable use policy for it so that it can be used for things that are truly forwarding plane issues, like I need a few more DSCP bits, or I need a few more flow label bits. But it cannot be used to communicate with the control plane. So things like the router alert should be deprecated. But it's a matter of, do we just throw everything out or do we throw most of it out? The question is, how much should we throw out and how much should we rehabilitate?
Okay, thank you. And very similar to this, there were two questions asked, one by Mohit and one by Willem, about there are new attacks over the internet and more will be coming. So should we define more security extension header beyond authentication and encapsulating security payload, maybe to find those attacks? Any taker?
So I can take that one if you wish. So
I was expecting you, Fernando.
Okay. So there's difference between theory and practice, right? So in theory, you might be able to do a lot of things. Now, quite unfortunately, it's 2022, and we still find super gross bugs in the code for the processing of extension headers. Should that be the case? Probably not. But clearly what we are getting from the feature when it comes to security are more problems than solutions. Should that be the case? Probably not. But there's a quite lengthy, history. Again, just search for the CVEs associated with IPv6. Most of them will be related with extension headers. Besides, a problem is that if you specify or introduce a feature, let's say some kind of feature related with security or any feature at all, you need that to be really able, okay? And we are already even having problems with basic stuff such as IPsec. Try to, create an IPsec tunnel and, happened to me, you just expected it to work and it just doesn't. So what you end up doing, well, you switch to something else, something that you can tunnel and maybe not ideal, but it gets the job done, or, at least it works. So that's a problem that we have. Not that I like it, but it's an unfortunate situation that we are in. So I would summarize that probably we'd like to have more features in there. In reality, probably our time is better spent, elsewhere.
Okay, and one
Eric,
related question. Oh, go on.
This is Mike. I was just going to make a comment, and I'm kind of a question behind. Somebody asked about why not deprecate them, and I think that's a valid question. But from my perspective, the reason not to is that there are features and functions in extension headers that make us want to deploy IPv6 and then successfully use it. We take those away, and a lot of the value, in my view, of IPv6 goes away. And guess what will happen with us enterprises? It'll be another couple of decades before we try to get off of v4. I'd rather see us, as this community here, harness the incredible power and knowledge of some of the people that are sitting around the tables here, myself excluded, of course, to address whatever issues we do identify exist with the H's. And then I just want to tack onto that in reference to things in support of a couple of things that a couple other people just said. Security for extension headers will become a big issue after we this is the way we work. I apologize. After we start deploying them, and then we figure out we need to encrypt them or whatever, and not everything will be able to be resolved in a tunnel. So that's my quick comments. Thanks, Eric.
Ron, you wanted to say something?
Yes. Maybe we could find a golden mean here, a compromise position, where we do something like deprecate the authentication header, but rehabilitate the ESP. Frankly, I was shocked to hear Fernando say that the ESP doesn't make it through. That's a pretty important feature of IPv6. And if people are dropping it, it'd be interesting to know why.
If I could just jump onto that for 10 seconds more, the kind of the ESP drop combined with what Mike had said, a lot of enterprises still on v4. I wonder where we're actually getting the drops and the failures that we're seeing from the different providers, different networks. I think that it'd be really useful for us to understand that well before we kind of throw up our hands or start thinking about throwing up our hands and saying, gee, stuff doesn't work, let's throw it all out, and we're just going to put everything over TCP port 80 and call it a day.
Just quickly, a +1 for what Darren just said. We need to understand a lot more about all of this, and in particular, that's one good example. Thanks.
Okay, and kind of an opposite questions compared to the Tony Lee's one, which is about how can, within a limited domain, can we add and create for very specific need, specific extension headers or specific options inside the extension headers to fit specific needs. So for an enterprise foo, get an extension header foo. Any taker?
I think it'd be great if more enterprises jumped in and started imagining what they might want to do in that area, for the simple reason that, maybe it won't all fly, but the simple reason it adds participation, it adds a diversity of views, and maybe defining additional extension headers to support their own unique capability won't be the ultimate ending point, William, but certainly, bringing it up and writing it down is an excellent starting point to understand, how those problems might be solved. So thanks for the question. I think it's great.
And just to be clear, while it's doable, there is an IETF RFC that says you should not define new extension headers, but either stick to an existing one. That's why I said we can define into the destination. As Nalini explained, this is the one and only seen at the end, as well as the up by up, the one seen at every places. And we can say the routing as well. But all of those can have option inside. So that's clearly the place where we can define option here. Any other comments from the panelists on this specific new header for security or whatever inside the limited domain? So maybe we talk briefly about security, and I think that's a topic that will define a question in its own, but there are also operational issues. And Fernando, I think you are writing a draft on operational issue or operational consideration with extension headers. Can you see a short word on this?
Yeah, so one of the the document that we author essentially tries to highlight what is the difference between theory and practice. And in theory, for at least for many of these headers, you shouldn't be processing them in the network, but that comes from the assumption that the network just forward packets and doesn't care what's on top of the packets, which in practice is quite the contrary. Okay, so you normally might have different sorts of ACLs where you need to know, what are the, what's in the payload of those packets. Like, for example, if, a packet is being, the destination of a packet is a certain host and a specific port on that host. And that means that at the end of the day, quite often, in order to process the packets, you need to access the upper layer header. Okay. Now, the structure of the extension headers doesn't make that task easy. And the more headers that you have and the longer the extension header chain, the more difficult it is, if at all possible, to process that layer 4 or to access that layer 4 information. And that's where the problem, comes in. In theory, you shouldn't be accessing anything on top of IP, but then for your regular operations, you have to. And you might have devices that, when that extension header chain gets long enough for whatever meaning, like in Justin's, measurements, it could be something around 64, but that depends on, the vendors and a number of things. And you get into the, the problematic situation in which you have to either blindly trust the packet or just drop it. And particularly when there's not much, we go back to the same thing. We don't have much of, except for limited domains use cases. You don't have like, a internet-wide use case. Normally what you end up doing is, dropping the packets. And, from an operator perspective, and even more from, the standpoint of a security guy, we have a feature. Do we have a requirement for it? No, we don't. Does it bring problems? Yeah, quite often. The end result and the outcome is unfortunately the obvious. So that's the reason for which, quite often they get, explicitly dropped. And normally, unfortunately, in the operational world, you have like 100 different problems, and you don't want to have 101 problems. So if there's a simple outcome or a simple decision that, will, save you from worrying about one more thing, unfortunately, that's normally the path that, many will take, I guess.
Okay, and beyond those operational consideration, I guess, and we all know there are some security issues. Can you briefly mention them related to extension headers?
Yeah, so I would say that there's essentially two things, okay? One of the things, which is probably the one of less concern, is that many of the devices, whether that's intrusion detection systems, whether that's firewalls and so on, at times they have a hard time, processing the extension header chains. So it can be the case that, for example, an attacker can simply bypass a firewall or an intrusion detection system by inserting a specific number of or a specific set of extension headers. So that's one of the the most simple implications. But I would say what's most of a concern is that there have been so many different bugs in the processing of extension headers, whether that's router implementations from different vendors, whether that's host operating systems, that at the end of the day, it's quite unfortunate, but we have had a long history of vulnerabilities associated with extension headers, and again, not having a super good use case on the table. Probably what you do is, or the solution to that is to to simply get rid of it. Again, most of the vulnerabilities have been about not getting the processing of extension headers right. The option, there's an option length that is too long and it spans past the packet. You might argue, well, but that could be easy to validate and, throw away the packet if it's malformed. Well, implementations, different implementations have failed to do that. And that's a problem that we have had.
So you think it's mainly an implementation issue, so will be solved at some point of time, and not so much in built in or caused by the extension header themselves, except routing header 0, right? Which was
yeah. So for the most part, when you think about vulnerabilities, it's not in the feature itself. So there's nothing bad about the feature itself, but reality shows that most vendors of different sorts, for one reason or another, got the code wrong. So you get one vulnerability published associated with the processing of extension headers, then you get another one, then you get another one, and at the end of the day, for the folks watching that, it's like they associate extension headers with vulnerabilities, even when the vulnerabilities are not really associated with the feature itself. But you could say, that aside, that the processing of the extension header chain, that you have to it's like a linked list chain, and you have to follow one header after the other. That kind of leads to some sort of complexity, you could say. Okay, and we all know where complexity leads us to. So complexity, hard to get it right, and if it's hard to get it right, that results in problems, and some of those problems are going to be security issues.
Eric, this is Mike. Can I tack on to what Fernando just said, because I think it's really good. And I, for the way we approach things at most enterprises, what he's talking about almost transcends security into operational best practices, which is incredibly important, I think. But I think it's both. And I think that when we talk about security is this wide topic. And what we usually do is we separate it into subtopics, and usually those are integrity, confidentiality, authentication, and authorization. I think we need to do all of the above. In other words, what Fernando was describing, and then also break security requirements regarding EHs into those categories and address them individually. I know that's not easy and anything that anybody wants to hear, but I think that's what it's going to take to do this right. Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. That's the beauty of being a panelist, right?
One comment about that probably what you'd want to do, as many have mentioned, in this panel, is that probably in order to, let's say, reduce the potential issues that you might have, and to get something that actually works, at least for within some constraints, you might want to reduce some of the flexibility that you have in the feature, and say, okay, well, this is going to be more constrained, but at least it works. Okay, but I would say for the most part that an attitude that we see quite often is no, we want to stick to the flexibility that we have because it's good, and that way yeah, it's okay, but it doesn't work, and you keep insisting on that, and it doesn't work. So when you look at the possible ways forward, it's, well, we keep insisting on the flexibility that we have, and we have a long history of it not working, or we try to be more pragmatic and say, well, we wish all these would have worked, but it doesn't. So why don't we just agree on, let's say, a subset of this, which maybe is not as ideal as we had wished, but at least it works and it's useful for getting some stuff done. I think that that's part of the challenge.
You got 2 thumbs up on that one, because if we try to get everything we need all at once, we're likely to have problems. Let's make something that works, that can be secured, that can be managed, and then maybe add to it over time. That's why I like a lot what you just said. Thank you.
So basically, it seems that we converge really that extension headers are really for limited domain where you can get everything under control. But how do you protect such a limited domain? For instance, with SRv6, Darren and Ron. Darren to start and then Ron after?
Sure. And we wrote this in 8754, that RFC. We spent a lot of time getting it right within the working group, I think, and then with the IESG as well. Protection at the edge is kind of the most obvious thing. We define our service endpoints, our SIDs, segment routing endpoints, out of specific address block within the domain. And we filter at the edge, and we define another filtering within the domain at each of the nodes to further protect traffic to that block. So it's the same as our infrastructure ACLs that we talked about earlier. just you first protect your edges and you protect your infrastructure. And that protection is done simply on a destination address and source address basis. There's no need to jump into other upper layer protocol headers within the packet, or even to query or wonder about what the extension headers are within the packet. So that's a primary one. And then within that same RFC, we defined a way of protecting the contents of the SRH and ensuring that the source who produced them within the domain was a valid source, or was able to, or was permitted to use that series of segments within the domain. And that's specific to the SRH. I mean, the other routing headers, in particular RPL, has similar limitations in applying infrastructure ACLs at the edge. So that's the current state of the art for protecting a domain that's using IPv6 internally with routing headers.
Ron, what is your point of view on this?
Okay. First, I'd like to take exception to something you said at the beginning, that extension headers are only good in the limited domain. I think there are some that can be rehabilitated in the global internet, the hop by hop.
Agreed.
Hopefully
I was summarizing,
ESP.
oversimplifying.
Okay.
Agreed.
But I would have agreed with Darren 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I remember running a network and believing that I had it protected by ACLs at the edge. These days, I'm not quite so sure. There's always the question, did you apply the ACLs the way you think you did? Did you apply the ACL, but it doesn't do quite what you think it does because, oops, you didn't think about the extension header that's so long that it gets past the ACL? Then the next question is, are you compromised from inside? Is there some host inside your limited domain that is actually your enemy? Is there some employee inside your limited domain that is actually your enemy? Knowing the extent that cyber criminals go through these days, it's very easy to believe that you're running in a limited domain, but it's almost impossible to know that you're running in a limited domain. If that weren't true, there wouldn't be so much success in cybercrime.
Sorry, Ron, just and I don't mean to, well, I will interrupt only briefly. Just a quick correction. I think the ACLs were only on the source and destination address. So I understand your point. Applying large ACLs into layer 4, it can be troublesome. Certainly limiting the complexity is a necessity, I think. Sorry though, please continue, and I apologize for the interruption.
Yeah, no problem. It's easy to believe that you're in a limited domain, but I believe it's impossible to know that you're in a limited domain. And I also believe that these days, a lot of people believe they're in one and aren't, and that's why they're victims of cyber crimes.
And on this one, what do you think about, I mean, we talk more and more about SDN and controllers and PCE or whatever. So in this case, is it easier to get a limited domain definition because you know what's inside?
Oh, Vyncke had a really interesting comment on something adjacent to this yesterday. Right, he was saying that, hey, we need to protect these sites. Like we can't just leave it open. Do we really want everything to be dark, right? I think where you can provide that protection, do it. I don't know at which point that you can no longer provide that level of protection. Although I know that there is some point out there that maybe a certain deployment wouldn't be able to, or a certain network wouldn't be able to say what is the edge of their domain or what is not. Ron, I don't know if you have any insights into that, but I thought it was interesting to go back to what Paul said yesterday, kind of tie that in.
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left for this panel, and I would love to get the last word from each of the panelists. for about 1 minute, as we'll be overrunning. With the extension at the chain of all the panelists will go more than 1 hour, so we'll be dropped per Fernando's and other studies, right? So let's stick to 5-minute extension headers or time header. Basically, I want to say, everyone, a few words about, are their extension headers useful or harmful? And I will go over the other way around, starting by the last one. Fernando, 1 minute.
I would say
Tic-tac.
I boil it down to they can be useful in limited domains. I probably would say that I have not much of a hope to make them useful for the the public internet. That's my take.
Yeah.
If we can get a proper definition of a limited domain, right? That's another thing to take, but that would be it.
Yeah, and as I said, the limited domain will depend upon the application and upon the extension headers, most probably. Okay, thank you, Fernando. This time.
Well, I think the same. So in limited domains, there is a mean. So we have a bunch of use cases already. And for the global internet, I don't know. So I cannot predict the future, but we'll see.
And do you think they are harmful?
Yeah, so they could be, depending on the extension header and the option that is used. And so I think that depending on each specific case, we could build some security for that. But yeah, definitely sometimes it could be harmful. Yeah.
Okay, so we went from the measurement and the security. Mike, you were in the middle in the enterprise before going to the service providers and the vendors. So do you think that the extension headers are harmful or useful?
Definitely useful, potentially harmful, and that's what we're here to address, to make sure that we can manage that down to a less harmful percentage. And I do agree that it should be deployed first in limited domains, and then maybe on the internet if we can resolve all those issues. And my final comment would be, if we can do more exploratory research like Geoff Huston has done, from other perspectives, maybe more data, and learn more about the causal factors here, it will make it easier for us and more effective for us to address these issues. But in general, thanks for setting this panel up. You guys have been great. Thank you.
Last few words from Ron.
Okay, both harmful and useful. To address harmful, we should deprecate some, constrain those that survive. And as for where they're applicable in the global internet or limited domains, let the killer application come and tell us which.
Crossing fingers. Darren.
Yeah, both harmful and useful, yes. Useful and in different scenarios, there's a lot of different extension headers and a lot of different sub options within those headers. Painting them all with one brush, I think, is going to be a mistake for the community in general. Let's find what works and understand where it works, and then expand it as the applications and uses require. And as we do that, I think we'll end up pushing some light into those corners that are currently scary that Mike had mentioned, and that we need more understanding and research into.
Okay, so it looks like we have, we being the panelists, but also all the participants into this connection, and all the IETF engineers and all the engineers worldwide has got more work to do and more imagination to deploy to get more useful and non-harmful use of extension headers. So time to wrap up. I would love to thank you, not only the panelists, but also Dhruv, to get the opportunity to discuss about this. I'm pretty sure in 2-3 years, we can get the same panel or in the same situation and see whether something has changed. I would love as well to thank you, the 3 person and the 3 engineers who asked questions. So Tony, Morid, and Willem, thank you for your questions. It helped me to ask questions to the panel and try to manage it. So for once, we are a shorter extension header chain. We are 2 minutes before the end. So I hope we passed the access control list and the gate to Dhruv. So thank you, Dhruv, again for the invitation. And thank you for the panelists again.
And thank you, Eric. That was an amazing moderation. This was a very engaging panel. Thank you. So I would like to thank all our speakers for the day, Nalini, Geoff, and all our panelists. Thank you for being part of Connections. I will give the links again. Please join our membership. We do events throughout the year, so not just Connections. There are events and webinars happening, so please stay in touch and be part of the organization. Last, thank you to our sponsors. Without you, we will not be able to do these events. Thank you. And see you tomorrow for Hot in Networking track. Again, 3 really great set of speakers. We'll be talking a lot of new things which are happening in ITF and IRTF. So see you tomorrow, guys. Take care.